My name is E.S. Wynn, and this is the Midnight Rider Comedy Podcast. So this is the first time I've ever done anything like this, sort of a spoken word comedy routine type of a thing. Hopefully, hopefully comedy. Hopefully you can get a few laughs out of it. It's always been sort of one of my bucket list things to do sort of a comedy routine, stand-up comedy routine at a comedy club someday, but I'm also just the most ridiculous kind of introvert in the world, and I absolutely hate to leave the house for pretty much any reason at all. So the idea of scheduling a event to appear in public is, man, it's an uncomfortable thought for me. That being said, I do have a book signing at an event that's in September. So here's hoping that goes well. I think I can get out of the house and meet the public once a year. I suppose that's reasonable. All right, so comedy. Let's see. I've got some interesting stories to share, ideas to share. I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy. I've done a lot of stuff in terms of voice acting in the last 5 years, and I thought, well, a little bit of freestyle spoken word comedy type of thing might be kind of fun to do. Plus, I absolutely just love stand-up comedy. I think I've probably seen every single stand-up comedy routine on Comedy Central and on Netflix at this point. Just love them. I've battled with some pretty severe depressions in my life, and stand-up comedy is one of the wonderful things that I can watch and just sit there and have, running in the background almost as white noise while I work sometimes, that really just lifts me up and brings me back to a more positive space in my life. And I figured, since I've spent so much time sort of inadvertently studying stand-up comedy, that I might make my own sort of somewhat approximately contribution to the genre, as it were. I had this idea the other day. I thought, hey, it really makes me happy, and maybe, just maybe, there's one person out there in the vast sea, a vast ocean of human beings that are hopping online and hopping on YouTube that might listen to this in the background as background noise while they're working and just get a kick out of it, and it might make their day a little easier and keep them from pulling a Hemingway, as it were. So, anyway, let's see here. So let me tell you a little something about me. I've written 44 books. 44. 4-4. Can you believe that? Most people only write maybe one book in their whole lifetime. But me? I've written 44. And I'm still a nobody. Isn't that just a kick in the teeth? People ask me how I could have written so many books. They say, "You're so young. How could you have written so many books? What's your secret?" I get stuck on the first sentence of a poem for school. Or I can't write an email. How do you write a whole book, much less 44 of them? You know what I say? Oh, it's easy. After a while, you get to this point where you just sit down and blah, words on the page. Then you spend the next month or so just kind of shuffling around whatever concept and chunky lines you threw up all over the paper, filling in the gaps until you have something worth reading. What I don't always tell people is the truth. The truth is, I have a $30,000 student loan with my poor starving stepmother as the co-signer. My goal is to make a living working from home as an author. You can't do that if you're working at Walmart. Trying to pay off a student loan from a flight school that might as well have gone belly up when the recession hit. So the truth is, basically, that if I'm going to keep my dad and my stepmother from sinking into the abyss of debt, I've got only a limited window of time to really kick some ass before the ceiling falls down around me and it's shipped off to Walmart time. That or McDonald's. Either way, one of those shitty kind of jobs like that. And of course, if you work at Walmart or McDonald's or Burger King or one of those corporate whorehouses, hey, more power to you. You are working a very hard job, realistically, very hard job. A job that is just beyond anything that most people would be willing or able to work. So, hey, kudos to you, man. Seriously. If it wasn't for you, I can say there are a lot of people that would probably go hungry. But it always helps to have dreams, and I'm one of those weird people who, oh man, I just can't imagine. I can't imagine working a job like that. Call me arrogant, call me, elitist, whatever. I think about what it would be like to work a job like that myself as the individual that I am, and I think, God, it's just, now there is a sure ticket for suicidal depression. Earl at Walmart. Earl as the Walmart greeter. Yeah, absolutely a straight ticket to suicidal depression. But, here's hoping. Here's hoping that I can pull it off. Things are looking good. They're looking pretty good, almost. I make enough to cover my student loan at this point. But, next year when it practically triples in cost per month to pay, well, that'll be a different story. But that's still a year away. So who knows what wonders will happen over the course of the next year. So enough about the loan. Let me tell you what I'm trained in. Let me tell you a little bit about my educational past here. Some interesting anecdotes and stories in there. If you would have asked me, 5 years ago, what I was going to be doing with my life, I would have told you I was going to be an English teacher. Very idealistic. I figured that was the course for me. How hard could it be? I was going to be one of those killer English teachers that just makes all the kids love English. Shows them the good stuff, the fun literature, tosses out all the dusty books and says, here, read this. Bring in Gibson and Stevenson and, Storm Constantine and some of these other authors that I just think are absolutely just amazing. And just wow these kids, Douglas Adams. Holy crap, wouldn't that be awesome? This is the vision I had. So what do? Well, I go to school, go to the university. I talk to the woman in the administration office and I say, hey, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to be an English teacher. I have no idea how to get there from here. I just know that I've been told I need to get an English degree. She says, oh yeah, we'll sign you up with a coordinator. It'll be great. We'll set you up with a coordinator who will put you on the right path, and there'll be no problems at all. You'll get right there. You'll be able to do this. It'll be wonderful. And so she signs me up with this teacher. She says, go talk to this teacher. He'll tell you everything you need to know about how to become an English teacher. So, being the good little student I was, I went and looked up this teacher, show up at his office, knock on the door, he opens the door, and this guy is like some sort of ultimate hipster. He's just sitting there on his desk with a cup of coffee and a turtleneck sweater and little hipster glasses, surrounded by dusty indie books, and he's got this, sort of way about him that sort of says artsy fartsy, and so I come up to him and I say, hey, my name's Irwin, and I'm looking to be an English teacher, and I have no idea what kind of things I need to do except that I need to get an English degree. And, I was pointed in your direction and told that if I talked to you, you would tell me what I need to do to be able to, become a English teacher, become this kind of ultimate English teacher. You know what he says to me? He says, oh, don't worry about a thing, kid. Just get your English degree. You'll be able to teach English. That's all it takes. A teacher told me this. And it wasn't until my last semester of college, my last semester at university, I think 2 weeks before the semester ended, that I realized there's like a whole certification process that goes along with this. You can't get a job as an English teacher in the state of California without this certification. I mean, just get your English degree and you'll be able to teach, kid. Not in the state of California. Oh, but he fucked me. Without even realizing it, he fucked me. But you know what? that's okay, because I did, as part of another class that I had a Scottish teacher who was teaching, we did have a thing where we had to go in and for a while attend a course, an elementary school course, and teach alongside an elementary school teacher. And I did that, and after one day of observing a class that was literally taught out of a taqueria, I'm not even kidding you, was absolutely reduced to tears by the state of the education system, especially here in the state of California. I was so reduced to tears that I gave up on my dream of being an English teacher. I said, nope, I cannot do this. So it's a blessing in disguise that I didn't go through the year and a half of certification stuff that was required to teach something that I would probably end up absolutely hating my life if I was teaching it. So, what do I do with my life then? Well, go back to the original plan. Be a writer. And hey, before you start dropping angry comments in the YouTube, section, the little comment section on there, it wasn't the fact that the class was taught in a taqueria. I mean, that really did shock me. That is something that I have never forgotten, that has never left me, and that I consider to be the ultimate mark of how bad the education system is, that it was taught out of, this restaurant. It was a combination of that, and it was the students. The students they had no interest in learning, Later on, when I became a math tutor, when I worked as a math tutor for about 6 months, that was most of the kids that I worked with. They didn't want to learn. They had no interest whatsoever in learning. Their teacher would say, you need to go spend some time with a math tutor or you're going to fail math. And the kid would say, well, that's fine because I'm not going to go to school after this. What do I need math for if I'm not going to college? I'm just going to go get a job right out of high school. Or I'm not even going to finish high school. I'm just going to go get a job, Yeah, like it's that easy. But, so the teacher would send these kids over to me and they'd say, you need to sit with the math tutor and work on algebra. And if you sit with the teacher or with the tutor and work on algebra for, an hour, let's say, then you can go. You can, leave and have the rest of the day off. And most of these kids, they just sat there the whole time watching the clock. And I'd go over a problem with them and then say, hey, do you get this? And they go, no. I say, okay, what do you not understand about it? Well, the whole thing. And then they just stare at the clock again and go over it again, and go over it again, go over it again. And there were a couple of them actually that made it clear to me that they had no interest at all in actually learning anything. They only had an interest in getting out of class early that day. So, if they knew that if they just sat there with me and sort of, parroted back the answers that I gave them, and, made me run around in circles trying to teach them something they didn't want to learn, then after an hour they could go and do their own thing and, whatever it was that they were doing after school. I don't know. But, so, call me picky, but, that's one of the things that just one of the reasons why I don't think I could ever work in the education system. I just cannot stand to be around people who have no interest in learning. I can stand to be around people who have no interest in learning, who are adults, I suppose. But I have no interest in trying to teach people who have no interest in what I'm trying to teach. And so, since English is one of those wonderful subjects that, like math, that most people have no interest in learning, not really a career choice that I would get into. But that's fine. Like I said, I've always yearned to be a writer ever since I was a little kid. When I was in first grade, I was given an assignment, several pages, just like 3 pages of binder paper to fill out throughout the course of the whole year. Write stories, here and there throughout the full year, and I would get full credit if I filled up, the front side of 3 pages, and that was it. That was all I had to do in terms of short stories. And being first grade, there were stories like, I have a cat, the cat is fuzzy, the cat is pretty, I love the cat. And I wrote a lot of those kind of stories, and I was so taken with the fact that even though I couldn't draw, being first grade. No one could. Well, I'm sure there are first graders who are amazing artists, but I know I wasn't no Picasso, and there wasn't anybody in the class that could qualify either. But I knew that since I couldn't draw, I could tell stories, though. I could use words to draw pictures in the mind, in a sense, and that was an incredible sense of power. And I had a lot of stories I wanted to put out there into the world. And so I filled up those 3 pages within the first week. Absolutely filled them up. Stories about my dogs, stories about my mom, stories about the cats that we had. We had a whole bunch of feral cats up there on the hill where I grew up. Stories about my grandma, stories about my grandma taking me places. Stories about this spot I had at the far end of the yard that was like a mud pie, basically this spot that I had dug out by hand as a toddler. I called it my dirt place, and I would play with kind of the infantile mind naming things. My dirt place. I had my dirt place, and I would play with various different robot toys and construction vehicles and build little space colonies in the dirt place, and write stories about the people who were driving the little construction vehicles through this crater of mud at the far end of the yard, and wrote so many stories, in fact, that the teacher stopped giving me paper. She told me, "No, Earl, you need to focus on other things. You can't just sit here and use up all our paper and all our class time writing all these different stories." I mean, and I was just getting into science fiction there in first grade, partly in terms of watching, but more in terms of writing. I was really inspired by a lot of films at the time. My father was really cool in terms of the films he let me watch, and by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, I was watching films like Aliens and RoboCop and Terminator, all pretty much on my own, without getting afraid or just getting really cool ideas. Love James Cameron's work, absolutely. I am a diehard James Cameron fan from way back. I still believe that Terminator 2, and there are lots of people who dispute me on this, but I still believe that Terminator 2 is the absolute greatest cinematic masterpiece in the history of mankind. And if you don't believe me, then it's probably been a while since you've watched it, and you should sit down and watch it, because that ending of that film still to this day, at 28 years old, makes me cry. And I know I'm not the only one who cries at the end. But anyway, back to the story. So the teacher stops giving me paper. By then, the book of short stories which I have collected is it's gotta be like 3-4 inches thick. It was huge. I'd run through a whole ream of binder paper at that point, and every story had pictures that were stick figures and various combinations of stories. I'd go back and forth from stories about the cats and the dogs and the grandmas to stories about big robots destroying cities. And I loved Godzilla, so I'm sure I wrote a fair amount about Godzilla. I have them around here somewhere. I have the stories around here somewhere, but the ones that I remember most are the ones about the robots and the cats and the cat robots and the grandmas and the robot grandmas and stuff like that. But I loved writing so much that even after the teacher said no more paper, I went home and did that little depression thing, was sad, felt like I was being denied something important. I just wanted to do schoolwork. What's wrong with that? I just want to create, and then I realized that my dad had these pads of lined yellow paper around the machine shop that my family owned at that time, and they would use them to jot down notes. You could buy 3 of them in a pack for a couple bucks back then, or like $1 or whatever, and so they always had these laying around everywhere. So that way, it's a family business. So there was always like 6 or 7 people working there at any given time, and the idea was there was a pad in every section of this shop, and if you needed it for some reason, you just grabbed one. You just grabbed it, jotted down notes, tore the page off, brought it with you. Well, I found out where these pads were stored, and because they were stored in the administrative section, the office section of the business, where my grandma Jo spent all her time typing things up and doing doing paperwork and whatnot for the business. And I waited until, because she wouldn't let me get into the supply cabinet. She was like, "No, you're too young. Last time you got in there, you took apart all the staples, and we found them all over the shop for like a week after that. So no." So I waited until she went home, and there were no locks on the cabinets. So I climbed into one of the cabinets and took out an entire plastic wrapped thing of these pads and snuck off with it down into the basement, where I had my lair, as it were, among the broken chainsaws, because that whole basement of that machine shop, the basement of that machine shop was the size of a suburban home, and that whole basement was full of dead chainsaws, dead lawnmowers, dead weed eaters, in various states of being taken apart, some of them from the 60s, just ancient stuff. And I'd go down there and I'd play down there, and I took these pads of paper down there, and I didn't like them as much at first because they were that yellow paper. They were that yellow lined paper, and I was used to using the white lined paper, and the rest of my book that I was putting together was all that white lined paper, and but I thought, well, better yellow paper than no paper at all. And my teacher wasn't going to give me any. My dad wasn't interested in buying me any white lined paper at the time. I don't know. I don't remember if I asked him or not. He'd probably look back and say, "Oh yeah, but whatever." So I started writing more on my book. I ran through at least one pad of lined yellow paper. I don't know how many pads I ran through ultimately, but I know I ran through at least one, writing these stories, before I started moving on to other things. And I created a comic book in first or second grade, with my friend Randy, who's just awesome. He's been my friend since, I think, kindergarten, so, but we got into comic books near the end of first grade, I think early second grade, something like that, and we got into comic books, and we got into Beavis and Butthead, and so we ended up sort of brainstorming this idea and working on a Beavis and Butthead-like project called Smelly and Smeller. Okay, so second grade, Smelly and Smeller. So anyway, we probably put together 30 pages of Smelly and Smeller's adventures. Smelly and Smeller were two stick figures that were always getting into trouble and always getting in jail, always getting put in jail for doing things like taking a dump on a bush in public. Fecal humor, scat humor, stuff that we find funny in second grade that we can still secretly laugh at when we're adults. Some of us can, at least. But after Smelly and Smeller, my friend Randy his parents moved, and he went off to another town, and I don't know what I did in terms of writing from that period, but I do know that in fourth grade I was introduced to poetry, and that was a magical moment. And I say magical, honestly, because the teacher that introduced me to poetry, I hated. Absolutely hated her. Mrs. Brandy was her name. She drove me nuts. Oh, man. We had gone, in third grade, I had a teacher that, it was because of math, the reason why I had such a hard time with Mrs. Brandy. I don't hate her anymore. I think she's great now. But math was the reason why I had such a hard time with her. In third grade, I had Mrs. Shotgun. That was her name. And Mrs. Shotgun and Mrs. Baker, who I had for part of second grade as well, taught math in a way that is very unfortunate. When you're learning algebra, you learn that if you have one number, if you have like a smaller number on the left-hand side, say like a 4, and you have a subtraction problem, and then you have a larger number on the right-hand side, say like a 7, you're going to end up with a negative number as the answer, as the result of this equation. But when I was in third grade and second grade, they taught us, the teachers taught my class, basically that it didn't matter which side the numbers were on, you'd always get, basically totally ignored integers. Totally, absolutely ignored integers. And so when I got into fourth grade and we got into integers, and the teacher introduced to us what I considered at that time to be very arbitrary rules of math, that if you subtract the numbers one way, it's positive number, and if you subtract the numbers the other way, it's a negative number. I thought that was just absolute crap. And I thought that it was arbitrary as hell, and I wasn't going to learn it. And so the teacher and I went round and round and round and round and round and round and round about that. But then, fortunately, math wasn't the only subject we were taught by Mrs. Brandy. But anyway, I had issues with her when she introduced us to poetry. But poetry really struck me. Absolutely struck me. Poetry was introduced to me as a new way of writing. Up until that point, the only types of writing I knew about were short stories, fiction, and little tiny book reports, nonfiction. And that was it. As far as I knew, those were the only forms that writing could take. And Mrs. Brandy introduced us to poetry. I don't remember who the poet was. Some classical poet. Well, not not classical, but some education classic poet like Frost or Tennyson or Browning. One of those that I absolutely love, and it enchanted me. The rhythm of it, the way the words moved, and I didn't even wait for her to finish the lecture. I pulled out a piece of paper from my binder. At that time, I had a binder with lined paper in it. And I started writing my own poem. And one of these days, I'm going to find the box that I put it in, because I put it in a plastic bag. I laminated that fucker. I put it in a plastic bag, and I put it in a box, and I set it aside because I knew that one day I was going to want to dig that thing out and read it. And I seem to have misplaced the box, the bag, and the laminated poem. But I do remember that it was about space. It was about being in space. Used a lot of lines like, the dark, cold abyss of space, floating there with. I described the sensation of having one's cheek pressed against the cold glass, staring out at the stars, and really played with imagery in it. And when I felt like it was done, or like I think it was almost done, I remember that Mrs. Brandy, sort of saying something like, "Isn't that right, Earl?" Because she's lecturing the whole time. Here I am, busy with my pen, and I look out and go, "What? What's going on?" And she repeated the question, and I answered it. I don't remember what it was, but I do remember she asked me what I was working on, and I said, well, I really liked the idea of poetry, so I wrote a poem. And she said, "Do you want to read it in front of the class?" And I said, "Yes, please." And so I went straight up to the front of the class, and I was always trying to impress these other kids. I felt like at the time, I don't know in retrospect, but I felt like at the time that no one liked me. I was always sort of the outsider kid, and I thought any chance to shine in front of these other kids, I would take, because if I could shine in front of them, maybe they'd start to like me. So I get up there in front of the class, and I've got my poem, and I read my poem in front of the whole class. And I remember the students, most of them were some of them were like, whoa, some of them were a little bored. But I remember that Mrs. Brandy was just kind of shocked, a little stunned that, and I don't know how good it was. Like I said, I don't know where the poem is anymore, but I do remember that she was sort of speechless for a little while. And I was really proud, and I entered the poem in some sort of school competition, won some sort of prize. I don't remember, like some sort of, one of those little things they give you, one of those little blue cloth ribbons or whatever. Here you go, first place, and you hang it on your wall with that clear Scotch tape, and 10 years goes by and it gets covered in dirt and falls down in a bunch of stuff, and then you're going through with broom at some point and picking up all this stuff that's been laying there on the floor, and your bedroom as a kid for all these years just gets shuffled away and thrown away with everything, all the other detritus of your childhood. But absolutely enamored with poetry at that age, and I kept writing poetry. I don't remember what all else I wrote, but I remember I wrote some more pieces, shorter pieces, before I moved on to other things, and was working on things off and on throughout my time at school, at the public school where I was at the time in Sonora, city of Sonora, where I grew up. Sonora is kind of a foothill town. It's a town up in the mountains of California. Kind of I like to refer to that area up there as Lovecraftian California, because when you think, a lot of people who aren't from California, they think, oh, California, it's all Los Angeles, it's all movie stars and beaches and surfing and palm trees. No, it isn't. The mountains, where I come from. There are people up there who speak with an Oklahoma accent. There are falling down wooden shacks. There are forests that stretch as far as the eye can see. Massive snow-capped mountains. I mean, there is a part of California that people in other areas of the United States and elsewhere about the world don't even know exists. It's like California's Appalachia. That's where I came from. But anyway, so out there in California's Appalachia, at that public school, I actually do have some poems that I wrote in sixth grade. Sixth grade was my last grade that I spent at that public school before I moved on, left the county and moved down to the valley, the Central Valley, down near Sacramento. It's not some miracle work of Keats or anything, but I do have a few, like this one, called Happiness. Happiness is a, quote, 5 senses poem. It goes like this. Happiness is an oceany blue. It tastes like maki rolls. It sounds like a great discovery. It looks like a new Lego set. It smells like pepperoni pizza. It makes me feel good inside. A lot of my poetry from 6th grade, I have this little book, or the teacher was, I don't remember what teacher I had for that class, but she was really great. Oh, Mrs. Doder, there it is. Turn the page, there it is. Mrs. Doder. Mrs. Doder was great. She was awesome. And another thing that was really great about that particular class is that in Mrs. Doder's class, she had us write poetry throughout this. We spent, I think, they did this rotating teacher thing where we spent 6 weeks with each teacher. And the 6 weeks I spent with Mrs. Doder were absolutely awesome. And while we were there with her, she had us assemble a whole bunch of poetry. We'd work on 1 poem a week or something like that, or 1 poem a day, I don't remember. But in the end, we had a book of this poetry. And she took it down to the local copy shop and had it, this little chapbook, bound for each of us students, and then brought in a friend of hers. I think it was my friend Carlin Wilcox, who's also really awesome. She's an old friend of mine. I think it was Carlin Wilcox who came in and did that Turkish ink painting for the covers, which is, I think that's what it's called, Turkish ink painting, where they put paint on like a mineral water, and they dip paper into it to create these really interesting liquidy patterns, and those are the covers for the books. Is this Turkish ink painting, which is pretty cool. So I still have that book. Couldn't throw it away. Couldn't give it to my parents. I had to hang on to it because I was so proud of my poetry. But I think it was about in 6th grade, possibly a little later than that my Uncle Ty moved in with my father and I. I don't remember exactly what happened. I think he fell on hard times. This would have been the mid-90s, say like 96, 97. And moved back up from Los Angeles to live with my father and I in Sonora. My father and my Uncle Ty were both born in the Sonora area as well. And the shop that my dad had at the time was a generational business. It was originally brought over from St. Louis, Missouri by my great-grandpa, my great-grandfather, Earl John Wynn Sr. And Earl John Wynn brought his whole family over from St. Louis when there was some sort of mafia thing going on over there, and I guess somebody showed up at his business, his machine shop there in St. Louis, and demanded protection money, wanted protection payments, and my grandfather said, "Screw that!" Packed up everything he had in the vehicle, packed up his wife and my grandfather, and they drove all the way from Missouri to California and set up shop actually in the town of Stockton, where they were for a little while before they realized there was a boom going on in the logging, at that time, logging town of Sonora. And they thought, hey, we're pretty good at doing small engine stuff. When they first moved to Stockton, they were doing cars and stuff too, but small engines was the specialization. Stuff like chainsaws, lawnmowers, weed eaters, snow blowers, that kind of thing. And so my great-grandfather and my grandfather moved the business from Stockton up to Sonora to service this logging community, figuring there's a whole lot of chainsaws they can fix for the guys going up and cutting trees out of the forest up there to make new homes elsewhere in the U.S. Well, times change, and suddenly, there's not a lot of people up there cutting trees down anymore, and so they had to diversify, and they ended up doing more lawnmowers because there were more retirees than loggers in the community, and the retirees had those fresh green lawns to mow, and so they spent a lot of time fixing lawnmowers and selling lawnmowers and that kind of thing. But my Uncle Ty worked in that business for a while. But he always had this dream of being a drafter. He wanted to be, or an architect, to be an architect. Real flair for interior design. Just there's paintings that he has and that my Grandpa Duke has from when he was a teenager of whole cityscapes, vistas that he put together with interesting architectural nuances and whatnot. He actually even, as practice, drafted a design for I think a 3-story house with one of those rotating garages, like a 9-car garage or something like that, for my father when you get rich, and for a few other people in the family as well. So that was kind of cool. And anyway, he owned a drafting business for a while. Spent a lot of time going back and forth from Sonora to Turkey Tech, which is the unofficial name of Turlock, the Stanislaus University. They're near Turlock. And once he got his degree and opened up Sonora Blueprint and Copy, he did that for a while. Moved down to Los Angeles, did some stuff down there. This was all when I was very small, so the details are a little hazy to me too. But eventually he came back to live with us, and he brought something with him that I had never seen before. He brought a word processor. It was one of those old Smith Coronas that would have like one line of text that you could type out on this digital display, and then you press enter and it goes and sticks it all on the top of the page. Before that, I had never written anything on a computer. I didn't know you could. And the only printer that I had, when my father and I had an Apple IIe, which is one of those ones with the green screen. It wasn't even a color screen. It was a green screen on the computer. And it had a dot matrix printer. But it didn't have any, never could figure out whether or not it had any sort of word processing program. It did have some early version of graphic editing program of some kind or another that you could design stuff on and then or make banners and then print the banners on the dot matrix printer. But there was some sort of problem with connection between that and the printer. If you created anything on there and tried to print it, it would just give you this screen of this sort of blur or blocky lines going up and down, green and black, oscillating. It's like thinking. It was always thinking, but it could never think hard enough to actually print anything, I guess. But so anyway, my uncle brings this thing over, this Smith Corona, this sort of high-tech electric typewriter, and he was doing stuff on it all the time. Typing up resumes, cover letters, sending them all over the state, if I remember correctly. And I had a book report in 6th grade that came up. I had to write a paper on Amelia Earhart, and always been fascinated with Amelia Earhart. I think she was one hell of a woman, and if I had been alive at that time, I probably would have been chasing her around trying to get her to love me. But I just always kind of like those strong, independent, feisty women. Women like my wife. My wife's strong and independent and feisty and awesome in all kinds of wonderful ways. But so I had to write this paper on Amelia Earhart, and I was told that it had to be typed. Now, I had never written anything on a computer before, or never turned in anything typed before. I'd always written everything by hand. I had seen people use computers to print stuff, but it was still very alien to me. And my Uncle Ty took me aside, and I was really scared. I remember crying, being terrified. What am I going to do? The Apple doesn't print. I don't know what's wrong with it. And he actually took me aside and showed me how to use that old Smith Corona. He sat me down and helped me put together that first typed research paper, like 2.5 pages long, something like that. We had like half the semester to do it. I don't remember exactly, but I got an A on it. And by then I was hooked. And so when the paper was done and turned in, I started asking him if I could use it more often. I started bogarting the thing and started hiding it from him because he would want to use it and to type up important adult things, like resumes. And I was always running off with the thing and typing up, science fiction stories about, I remember this one. I was really enamored with the Borg from Star Trek. I just absolutely love the Borg. The Borg, even to this day, are my favorite science fiction bad guys. And I remember that I was writing this story that was sort of a combination of like what would happen if the Borg came to assimilate a species, and at the same time that species was being sort of infested by the xenomorphs from the Alien franchise, and like what would happen when these two sort of the technological met the monster, as it were, and what would happen. And I don't remember exactly what was going on with this storyline, but I do remember that it was very emotional for me because you have this stalemate where the Borg are trying to assimilate the aliens and the people, and the aliens are sending their little facehuggers into the Borg ship and sort of chest bursting these drones, and then in the end you have this one hero who realizes that his whole race, that's sort of at the mercy of these two species, he realizes his whole race is on its way out, so he sets off a series of thermonuclear devices all over the planet's surface that just turn all three species into ashes. And I remember one of the reasons why it was so emotional to me is that my dad had made a bonfire in the backyard at the time, and it was sending up all these hot coals and ashes, just this big plume of ashes and hot coals. And I remember looking at it and being enchanted by it and thinking, what if those were little bits of civilization, as it were, just sort of floating up in the wind and the heat from this nuclear reaction in the story. And I wrote other stuff too. Then I started really getting into Star Trek about that point, and laid the groundwork for what would later on become the Shintundians from Highforge Legacy. I didn't actually start writing Highforge Legacy until I was 16, but before that, when I was in high school, I wrote some other stuff between 6th grade and high school. Not a lot, just a few things here and there. My mom kept encouraging me to write. Once I figured out how to type things, she set me up on an early version of WordPerfect, which became my tool of choice for like 15 years. I still use it. I still have a copy of WordPerfect 9 from 1998, I think, that I use because I have an older computer, and it can load up WordPerfect 9 in about 30 seconds, whereas a lot of the stuff that I do in terms of formatting and final edits I do on OpenOffice, and even running without all the JavaScript or Flash or whatever it is. OpenOffice takes a good minute or 5 minutes even to open, and don't you dare put it in the background and let it sit, because you minimize it and you let it sit while you do other stuff, and you try to open it up again. Everything from typing to saving has another 30-second wait before you can use it again. I love the program, don't get me wrong, but 1 gigabyte of RAM on a computer like this one is just not enough to run a modern version of OpenOffice without some fun lag issues. Once it loads up and it has a chance to sort of find its brain, it's fine. It's fast as all get out. But by then, if I might as well just pen the stuff down on a piece of paper. I get kind of in a hurry, kind of a workaholic in my own right, and so shorter stuff I still pen on WordPerfect 9 because I can't do anything longer on WordPerfect 9. WordPerfect 9 has burned me too many times. It's a wonderful program. I know it like the back of my hand. I can work magic on it. But at the same time, you get anything on there that's over 10,000 words in length, and you start having problems. Better make sure you back up stuff too. I made the mistake. I actually lost. Okay, Pink Carbide is one of my series that I've written, right? I actually lost the 4th book. I've almost completed. I got up to the last few chapters of the 4th book, this mythical 4th book of Pink Carbide that people who've read the series know about. I actually got up to within a few chapters of completing the book on 2 separate occasions. And both times, I was so excited by the story, I was so into it, I was so drawn into the storyline that I didn't even think to back it up while I was writing it. And WordPerfect, it got up to that 45,000 word range, and WordPerfect crashed and didn't delete the file, but corrupted it, made it totally inaccessible. The first time it corrupted the file, I don't remember what happened to it. I remember panicking and getting all upset and throwing a few things and breaking a few other things and crying for several days, that kind of thing that you do when you lose several months worth of work, just down the toilet like that. And you think I would have learned, but it was a couple years between one version and the other. And the second version, I got really excited, really into it, really getting it, like, man, this is even better than the first version. And I get up to about 45,000 words, and sure enough, it corrupts it again. And this time, when it corrupted it, it did this weird thing that I've never been able to figure out. I still have the file around here somewhere. It did this weird thing where it gets up to about page 20 of the manuscript, and then just turns the rest of the data into zeros. When you look at it through a hexadecimal editor, it's all zeros. Yet the full weight of the file is there. The file is still like 61 kilobytes. But there's nothing after like page 20, page 21, something like that. And I've had all kinds of friends take a look at it. I've had all kinds of programs run through it. I've tried, extracting the text with various, freeware and shareware programs, but no luck. Anyway, so my mom was teaching me how to use WordPerfect, not 9, but like WordPerfect 6 or something like that, and on her old Packard Bell computer. And I started writing some various things, and then high school came around, and I decided when I was 13, that I just couldn't stand. I did homeschool for like, I think 7th and 8th grade. I did homeschool. But when I was starting to get near the end of 8th grade, I decided that I needed to be around kids my own age again. And when my mother and my stepfather, they were married at the time, they moved out to a little town called Porterville, which is out there by Visalia, Bakersfield area. And they said, you can continue to do homeschool. In fact, it'd probably be preferable if you do homeschool, because we moved up to this little tiny town in the middle of absolutely nowhere called Camp Nelson. And Camp Nelson was a 45-minute bus ride up a twisty mountain road that was vomit-inducing every time you took it up or down. And they said, well, hey, if you do homeschool, then we only have to go into town about once a week. We can get groceries, we can do everything, then we just stay up here in the woods, like something out of The Shining, for a week or two at a time, sort of stock up and go, but I didn't want to. I wanted to be around kids my own age, and more specifically, being a 13-year-old guy, I wanted to try to, track down some girls. I wanted to get laid, and I had all these visions about how easy it was going to be, and all these stories that different, dirty relatives who will remain nameless that I haven't mentioned yet. So it's nobody I've mentioned yet in this episode. But different dirty relatives were saying things like, "Man, when you're a teenager, you got to get that teenage pussy." You know what I mean? So it's kind of fueled on those stories. Yeah, yeah. I only have a narrow window of time when it's legal, and so I part of my motivation for going back to public school. And while I was in public school, I spent a semester at Porterville, and then by the end of that semester, I said, "Screw this, screw this. I am not going to go to this high school anymore." And it wasn't the idea of high school itself. It was the fact that it was that particular high school. At that particular high school, I was part of the minority, and you know, it's interesting how being a part of the minority, you get stomped pretty often, and there was a lot of infighting with my particular minority, and the majority was above us in social ranking, and so they'd stomp on us and spit on us, and then we'd stomp and spit amongst each other, and so there were no friends in my little minority. And mostly we just spent our time beating the crap out of each other, and I decided that I didn't really want to be a part of that. I didn't really want to be a part of a school where I got the crap beat out of me all the time, where I had to, punch other kids in order to be left alone during lunchtime. And so I said, screw this. And at the time, my friend Randy, who I've mentioned earlier, I made friends with in kindergarten or first grade, was going to Sonora High School back in my hometown. And he told me, hey, I'm there. And my dad said, hey, if you come back, you can move into the house on the hill with me. And I did. So I said, hey, I'm going to move back, and then at least I'll have an ally. In Sonora, I'm not a minority. And sure, I got into plenty of fights, little ones. Kids, grabbing my backpack. And, there was this one time this kid come running up and punched Randy in the back of the head so hard he broke his knuckles, and my friend Randy and I and this other guy we knew at the time named Jared Lazar, I unslung my backpack, Randy unslung his backpack. We were getting ready to beat the crap out of this kid, and Jared ran off, but he didn't want to get in any fights. I don't really blame him, but anyway, so Randy was at that high school, and so I came back and I moved in with my father, and I think it was probably only about 6 months that my father lived there at that house on the hill with me before he fell in love with my current stepmother, and moved out to Tuolumne City with her. So I had the whole house to myself, which was pretty cool being 16 years old. It would have been a lot cooler if I had had any confidence, had any belief in myself and my social skills, as it were, and hadn't been just the most raging nerd you've ever seen. If I had been into partying, it would have been an incredibly great asset. It wasn't bad having the whole house to myself at 16, being able to just run around and do whatever I want, be an adult without having to have any of the adult responsibilities. And I spent most of my time playing Diablo 2 when I was at home. Just loved that game. That game is the altar upon which I have sacrificed more of my life than anything else, except probably on the altar of Minecraft, which is kind of ridiculous. But Minecraft, that's like a digital Zen garden. So I think that I can file that away under just normal stress relief and tension relief and whatnot. But anyway, so I started writing in high school, and I didn't write much at home on the computer. My typing skills kind of dropped off, and usually whenever I got on the computer, I just wanted to play Diablo 2 anyway. But I started writing by hand, and I didn't have a lot of paper, and I didn't really want to beg my dad to get me more paper or borrow paper from my friends. No car. I was kind of isolated up there on that hill, and I think I was 15, not 16. But anyway, kind of isolated up there on that hill. Didn't have the ability to go into town and buy binder paper, and so I got to the point where I was writing 3 lines of text for every binder paper line line on the binder paper that I was using. So I still have these somewhere around here. The first novel I was working on, called The Ice Run, which was about this husband and wife team who are in this future where the earth is totally dried up. All the liquid water resources have been they're gone. There's nothing. Even the seas are empty. And humanity is on its way out, you know what I mean? And the last hope is this husband and wife team who are part of the Black Navy, which is this sort of the standard, U.S. Navy being on the water, the Black Navy being in the black, in space. And I was writing about the ship. I don't remember what the name of the ship was, but the book was called Ice Run, and I had written probably 3 or 4 pages. It worked out at 3 lines per binder paper line, front and back. Ended up with these 3 or 4 pages that looked like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and kids were always asking me about them because I would write during class. The classes in high school were just so ridiculously easy. And not to brag, but I don't. Maybe it was the classes I was in. I don't know. Maybe they were sort of lower level classes, but the classes I was in school were so easy that I would just sit there and write on my book while the teacher lectured and pass the exams with like a B or whatever. And I assembled about 10,000 words of this book. Never finished it, but got about 10,000 words of it, and then spent a lot of time typing it up, and never really did anything with it. But wanted to do stuff with it, and then I ended up moving back in with my mom because I wanted to get out of high school. My friend Randy was doing his own thing. I don't remember what, but I remember I wanted to get out of high school early, and my mother had gotten out of high school early through a GED-like program called the CHSPE, which is this California high school proficiency exam. Basically allows you to graduate high school at 16, and I wanted to do it. My dad said, "No, you need to be involved in the social system. You need to, be involved in this." And like, yeah, I need to be involved in kids beating the fuck out of each other. That sounds intelligent. And my mom said, "Well, if you come move back in with me and help me take care of your little sister, that who at that time was real small. She was just a couple months old, just a baby. Come move back in with me. I'll help you study for the CHSPE, and I'll help you take it, and you can start going to college at 16." And I was all over that. So I moved back in with her. She had separated from my stepfather at that time, and we moved into this little tiny house in Weimar, which is another. Weimar is another little town. It's out between Auburn and Colfax. A little tiny town that's in another area, sort of Lovecraftian California. Those mountains and trees, and California's Appalachia, just about 2 hours away from Sonora. And while I was there, we had this neighbor named Bob who introduced me to Lord of the Rings. Actually, he introduced me to Hobbit, and I read Hobbit from cover to cover. Just absolutely loved it. It was a great book, and I was talking to him about the book that I had been writing called The Ice Run, the science fiction piece. And he said, "Oh, and you love The Hobbit, which is fantasy." He says, "Next thing you know, you'll be writing, The Hobbit in space." And I thought, dwarves and elves in space? What a brilliant idea! And so I wrote the book that would become Highforge Legacy, and that took me a long time. And I actually penned the sequel too, but I was playing StarCraft a lot at that time, and some bunghole had piggybacked a worm worm virus on a StarCraft map file. It was I think it was 8-player Marine Defense, I think it was, and I downloaded the file thinking, "Hey, I'm going to play Marine Defense," and it totally killed the hard drive. I don't know what it did to the hard drive, but I took it to a technician and he couldn't even get it to work, and I lost the entire sequel to Highforge Legacy. I think I have 10 pages of it that I had saved on a floppy disk at the time. But Highforge Legacy stayed in a state of sort of permanent edits as I matured as a writer until just last year, just in 2012, when I finally said, "Screw it, I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to go through this thing." It took like 3 months to go through that 300 and some odd page monstrosity and clean it up to the point where it could be saleable. So I cleaned up that book and put that out there, good 10 years after I originally penned it. But I didn't write a lot between the original version of High Forge Legacy and the uh, the books the Pink Carbide series, which was my first published book. I wrote a lot of short stories, but I spent most of my time playing video games, absolutely addicted to it. And by the time I realized that I was sort of spending too much time playing video games, sort of getting up into my adult years, um, I felt like I had had a few rejections from magazines. I only sent my stuff off to the best magazines, Asimov's, Analog. I had had a few rejections of the stuff that I had sent them, and obviously, I mean, I'm sure they get so much stuff they probably just turn stuff away because they don't have any room to publish it. Not saying the stuff I sent them was all that great because I was still a young writer at the time, but got a few rejections and had suffered through a crappy minimum wage job and sort of decided that I probably wasn't going to make it as a writer, so I needed to get a job that, brought me a good chunk of cheddar. And so I ended up going off to Spartan College of Aeronautics and Technology, which is where I got my wonderful student loan from. Because while I was there, they taught the oldest flight school in the world, great flight school, lots of great friends made there. But the idea of that school was that because it's the oldest flight school, because they had all these connections in the industry, if you went through this school, if you went through Spartan, you would come out the other side as an airline pilot. Yeah, you'd probably rack up $90,000 worth of student loans, but you'd come out the other side in 3 years with all the certifications, with the turboprop rating, everything. You'd be ready to go, right? So I said, hey, sure bet, sure deal. That sounds good to me. Moved all the way out to Oklahoma, got an apartment and everything, and signed up for a student loan. And I didn't have any credit at the time, so my stepmother had to co-sign on it. And she was like, hey, he's going to be an airline pilot. Nothing to worry about here. Unfortunately, while I was there, they had, I think, they had a ton of contracts with China at the time. And these students were all from China. They were going to fly for the Chinese airlines, and they were all being trained at Spartan, and along with a very small class of domestic students, here from here in the U.S. And then one night in the middle of the program, the training program, that probably 6 months into the time I was there, the Chinese, whoever it was that was sponsoring the Chinese students, pulled all the contracts like that overnight, shipped everybody home, and suddenly these teachers that are paid on commission are trying to make their house payments and car payments on a very small population of domestic students. So I went from rapidly approaching my private pilot's license to getting stuck redoing things like slow flight over and over and over again because it just wasn't quite perfect. Yeah, okay, it wasn't quite perfect enough. Yeah, you're just wanting to siphon off my money. But the real kicker for me came when they sold off. They had a couple King Airs, which is a plane that you could get your turboprop rating in, and the only thing that separated Spartan realistically from your standard crappy airfield, well, not crappy, but your standard small town airfield school that just runs Cessna 152s, was those King Airs. That was it. That was what separated them, and they sold them off. They were gone. So how do you get the turboprop rating? How do you go from being a little pilot here on the sidelines, flying 152s and 172s, to flying the airliner if there's no bridge in between? And so I said, screw this, and I bailed. Unfortunately, because I bailed, I don't think that there's anything I can do about the student loan. I'm kind of stuck with it until I pay it off in 15 years. But yeah, so I came back to California after that. While I was out there, I wrote Pink Carbide and spent probably a year shopping it around, and got lots of positive feedback, but I only shopped it to the largest companies, and no one picked it up. So I ran into an article about some author that was having a lot of success with self-publishing, so I said, screw it. I found a couple editors that were, really good, that were willing to take a look at my work, for free and go over it, and They helped me do Pink Carbide and the sequel, Aluminum Opus, and even the third book, Carbonaria. And that was about 2007, and I just kind of took off from there. From there, I've pretty much been writing nonstop, and it's that student loan that's kept me going. It's always there on the horizon. The student loan, it's gonna come down and eat you. And I spent, oh goodness, I spent 4 years at various colleges getting my English degree, off my own blood and sweat. Wasn't interested in taking out any additional student loans. My mom let me crash at her place. I stayed there for a while, and worked on my other books. And in the years since, I've gotten up to the point now where this year, as of March 27th, 2013, I have 44 books. I'm aiming to have 50 or 51, actually, so I can say over 50 books before I turn 30, which is May of next year. So it's a little bit tight, but only 7 more to go, so I think I can do it. And so that's sort of me and and my history in writing, as it were. A little survey of my growing up and whatnot. And I'm thinking I'm probably gonna wrap this up, and if people like it, if it's not just totally boring as all hell, if maybe people even get a laugh or two out of it, I might do a second episode. We'll see. I want to see what kind of feedback I get. I want to see if people think this is a total waste of time, which I'm sure. I've done my fair amount of voice work on YouTube, and there's always the thumbs down and the go kill yourself comments and whatnot. I'm sure I'll get my fair share of those, but you know what? If I get enough comments from people saying this is awesome, keep up the good work, when's episode 2 coming out, or stuff like that, then I could see myself running another one through. But who knows? Maybe this will just be some forgotten archive of my past that some kid or relative or distant child or cousin of mine in the future will listen to and go, wow, that Earl guy was interesting, or wow, that Earl guy was a real putz. He liked to listen to himself talk a lot. But hey, if even one person finds some enjoyment out of this, even just a little nugget of enjoyment, that's why I do it. But alrighty, well, thanks for listening. This has been E.S. Wynn, the Midnight Writer, so called because I sleep all day and write all night, quite literally. And I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for listening, and look out for episode 2, and let me know if you liked this one so that I have a reason to make a second episode. Alright, take care.